The setting sun cast long shadows across the quiet streets of Pine Grove, a peaceful suburb just outside Norfolk, Virginia. Rear Admiral James Harrington let out a tired sigh as he turned his rental car onto Maple Street. After 6 months at sea commanding the Fifth Fleet, all he wanted was to sleep in his own bed. The small 2-story house at the end of the cul-de-sac had never looked so inviting. Harrington was not in his uniform tonight. Dressed in a simple blue sweater and khaki pants, he looked like any other middle-aged man coming home after a long day. The silver in his hair caught the last rays of sunlight as he adjusted the rearview mirror. The rental car, a nondescript black sedan, had been waiting for him at the airport when his military transport landed 3 hours ago. Almost home, he whispered to himself, checking his watch. It was just past 8:30 p.m. His wife was visiting their daughter in Boston, so he'd have the house to himself tonight. A quiet dinner and maybe a glass of that scotch he'd been saving seemed like the perfect way to end the day. The flashing blue and red lights in his rearview mirror came as a surprise. Harrington checked his speed. He was going 5 under the limit and signaled immediately, pulling over to the curb. 27 years in the Navy had taught him to respect authority, and he assumed this was a routine traffic stop. 2 police officers approached, one on each side of the car. Their hands rested on their holsters, unusual for a simple traffic stop. "Evening, officers," Harrington said calmly through his open window. "Did I do something wrong?" The officer on the driver's side, a young man who couldn't have been more than 25, seemed tense. "License and registration, please." "Of course," Harrington replied, reaching slowly toward the glove compartment for the rental papers. "The car is a rental, so I'll need to grab the—" "Freeze! Don't move." The officer on the passenger side suddenly drew his weapon, pointing it directly at Harrington. "Hands where I can see them." Confused but keeping his composure, Harrington raised his hands. "Officer, I was just reaching for the rental agreement." "Step out of the vehicle slowly," the first officer commanded, his hand now also on his drawn weapon. Harrington complied, moving deliberately. "Officers, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm Rear Admiral James Harrington of the United States Navy. I just returned from deployment and—" "Face the car and put your hands on the roof," the second officer interrupted. He was older than his partner, but equally tense. Again, Harrington complied. Years of military discipline had taught him to remain calm in stressful situations. As he placed his hands on the car, he said, "My military ID is in my wallet, left back pocket. I'd like to show it to you." "We'll get to that," the younger officer said, beginning to pat him down. "We had a report of a stolen black sedan in this area, matching this description, driven by a man in a blue top." Harrington felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "This is a rental car from the airport. I have the paperwork right in the glove compartment." Across the street, porch lights were coming on. Neighbors were beginning to notice the commotion. Mrs. Chen, who had lived across from Harrington for 15 years, stepped onto her porch, phone in hand. "Jim, is everything okay?" she called out. The younger officer turned toward her. "Ma'am, please go back inside. This is police business. That's Admiral Harrington," Mrs. Chen protested. "He lives right there." She pointed to Harrington's house just 50 yards down the street. The officers exchanged glances but didn't lower their weapons. The older one spoke into his radio. "Dispatch, can we get a check on a James Harrington, claims to be a Navy admiral?" While they waited for a response, the situation grew more tense. Another neighbor, Tom Wilson, a retired Coast Guard officer, had come outside and was recording the scene on his phone. "Officers," Harrington said calmly, "I understand you're doing your job, but this is a mistake. I'm just trying to get home after 6 months at sea. Sir, we need you to lie face down on the ground with your hands behind your back," the younger officer said. Ignoring Harrington's explanation, Harrington hesitated. In all his years of service through combat zones and diplomatic crises, he had never been treated like a criminal. But he also knew that resisting would only make things worse. "I'll comply," he said, "but I want it noted that I'm identifying myself as a Rear Admiral in the United States Navy, and I'm being cooperative." As Harrington lowered himself to the asphalt, he could feel the rough surface against his cheek. The younger officer quickly handcuffed him while the older one began searching the rental car. "Jim!" Mrs. Chen called out again, her voice distressed. "This is outrageous. He's a war hero." "Ma'am, please stay back," the younger officer warned. Tom Wilson moved closer, still recording. I served under Admiral Harrington during Desert Storm. You're making a serious mistake here. The radio on the older officer's shoulder crackled to life. Unit 17, be advised. We have confirmation of a James Harrington, Rear Admiral, U.S. Navy. Current address matches the 400 block of Maple Street. Despite this confirmation, the officers didn't immediately remove the handcuffs. The older one came back from searching the car, rental agreement in hand. Paperwork checks out, he said quietly to his partner, and dispatch confirmed his identity. Still, they seemed uncertain about how to proceed. The younger officer kept Harrington on the ground while they discussed the situation in hushed tones. By now, several more neighbors had gathered, their expressions ranging from concern to outright anger. Mrs. Chen had called her son a lawyer. Tom Wilson was on the phone too, speaking rapidly to someone he referred to as Captain. Officers, Harrington said from his position on the ground, I understand you were responding to a report. But I've identified myself, your dispatch has confirmed who I am, and you've verified the rental car paperwork. I believe the appropriate next step would be to remove these handcuffs. The younger officer finally knelt down. Sir, we're going to help you up now, he said, his voice less confident than before. He unlocked the handcuffs and helped Harrington to his feet. Brushing asphalt from his clothes, Harrington maintained his dignity. He wasn't a man who lost his temper easily, but there was a steely edge to his voice when he spoke. I'd like both of your badge numbers and names, please. The officers exchanged nervous glances. The older one spoke first. Sir, we were responding to a report of a stolen vehicle. The description matched. Your badge numbers and names, Harrington repeated firmly. And I'd like to speak to your supervising officer. Tom Wilson approached, still recording. I've already called the station. The watch commander is on his way. The younger officer looked increasingly uncomfortable. Officer Brian Taylor, badge number 4583, he said. Officer Robert Johnson, badge number 3927, the older one added. Harrington nodded, committing the information to memory. My military ID, he said, holding out his hand. Officer Johnson quickly retrieved Harrington's wallet from the car and returned it. Harrington opened it to show his military identification, complete with his rank and security clearances. As you can see, officers, I am who I said I am. His tone was not angry, but it carried the weight of authority that had commanded thousands of sailors. A police cruiser with flashing lights pulled up, and a man in a sergeant's uniform stepped out. His face fell as he took in the scene. Admiral Harrington? The sergeant said, recognizing him immediately. I'm Sergeant William Peterson. What's happened here? As Harrington explained the situation, Sergeant Peterson's expression grew increasingly troubled. He turned to Officers Taylor and Johnson with a look that promised a very uncomfortable conversation later. Admiral, on behalf of the department, I want to apologize for this misunderstanding, Peterson said. These officers will face an immediate review of their actions tonight. Harrington nodded, his expression unreadable. I expect a full report of this incident on my desk by tomorrow afternoon. I'll be speaking with your chief of police in the morning. The neighbors were still watching, still recording. What had started as a simple mistake had become something much more serious. A high-ranking military officer held at gunpoint and handcuffed in front of his own home. As Harrington finally walked toward his house, neighbor Tom Wilson fell in step beside him. Admiral, this isn't right. They can't just walk away from this. They won't, Tom, Harrington replied quietly. They most certainly won't. Inside his home at last, Harrington closed the door and leaned against it, allowing himself a moment of vulnerability now that he was alone. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from controlled anger. In all his years of service to his country, he had never been so humiliated. He pulled out his phone and made 2 calls. The first was to his friend, Captain Richard Hayes, the Judge Advocate General for the Norfolk Naval Station. The second was to his longtime friend, Congressman Andrew Thomas, who served on the House Armed Services Committee. By midnight, what had happened on that quiet suburban street had reached the offices of the Chief of Naval Operations and the desk of the Virginia governor. By morning, the story would reach the Pentagon, and by tomorrow afternoon, those 2 police officers would learn exactly what it meant to hold a rear admiral at gunpoint without cause. As Harrington finally poured himself that glass of scotch, he wasn't thinking about revenge. He was thinking about accountability, about systems that needed fixing, and about making sure this never happened to anyone else. whether they wore stars on their shoulders or not. The first battle had been fought on his own front lawn. But the real fight for justice was just beginning. The Pine Grove police station buzzed with unusual activity for 7 a.m. on a Tuesday. Officers from the night shift hadn't gone home, and day shift officers were arriving to find the station in a state of controlled chaos. At the center of it all was Chief of Police Daniel Walker, who hadn't slept since receiving a call at 1 a.m. about the Harrington incident. "I want every second of body cam footage, every radio transmission and every piece of paperwork related to last night's stop on Maple Street," Chief Walker barked to the room of officers. His normally calm demeanor had been replaced by tightly controlled anger. "And where are Officers Taylor and Johnson?" The two officers in question sat in a small conference room, still in their uniforms from the previous night. Neither had been allowed to go home. Both looked exhausted and increasingly worried as various higher-ranking officers came and went, none making eye contact with them. "We were just following protocol," Officer Taylor said quietly to his partner. At 24, he was still in his first year on the force. The car matched the description. "You ran the plates and they came back as a rental." Officer Johnson, a 12-year veteran, shook his head. "We didn't follow protocol. We escalated without cause. We didn't properly identify him after he told us who he was." He rubbed his face with both hands. "And we did it to a rear admiral in front of his own house." Outside the conference room, Sergeant Peterson was showing the body cam footage to Chief Walker and two stern-faced men in suits, one from the mayor's office and one from the Navy's Judge Advocate General's office, on the small screen. They watched the encounter unfold from Officer Taylor's perspective. The tension in the room grew as they heard Admiral Harrington calmly identify himself multiple times, only to be ordered to the ground. "Pause it there," said Commander Thomas Hayes, the JAG representative. "At this point, your officers had 3 separate confirmations of the Admiral's identity: his own statement, the neighbor across the street, and the retired Coast Guard officer. Yet they proceeded to handcuff him and place him face down on the pavement." Chief Walker couldn't defend the actions. "There's no excuse for this," he admitted. "These officers failed to follow department procedure for identifying military personnel." "This goes beyond procedure, Chief," the mayor's representative said. "The video from the neighbors is already online. It's been viewed over 200,000 times since midnight." As if on cue, Chief Walker's phone rang. It was the mayor himself. While this meeting continued across town at Norfolk Naval Station, Admiral Harrington was in his office. Despite having just returned from deployment, he had arrived at 6 a.m. dressed in his full uniform, the 4 stars on his shoulders gleaming under the office lights. His aide, Lieutenant Commander Paul Rivera, entered with a stack of messages. "Sir, I have the Secretary of the Navy on line 1. The Governor's office has called twice. There are 17 media requests for interviews, and the Chief of Police has been trying to reach you since 5 a.m. Harrington nodded, his face showing none of the fatigue he felt. "Tell the Chief I'll meet with him at 2 p.m. today. The Secretary of the Navy gets priority. Put him through. And get me everything you can find on Officers Taylor and Johnson." "Already done, sir," Rivera replied, handing over 2 thin folders. "Neither has significant disciplinary history. Taylor is a rookie, less than a year on the force. Johnson has 12 years of service, mostly good evaluations." Harrington took the folders. "What about their commanding officer?" "Sergeant William Peterson. 20 years on the force, decorated twice for bravery, no major complaints." Harrington absorbed this information silently. He wasn't interested in destroying careers, he wanted accountability and change. The phone on his desk blinked, indicating the Secretary of the Navy was waiting. As Harrington picked up the phone, back at the Chen household across from where the incident had occurred, Mrs. Chen was giving her 3rd interview of the morning, this time to a national news network. "I've known Admiral Harrington for 15 years, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "He's a war hero. He commands thousands of sailors, and they treated him like a common criminal in front of his own home." The reporter nodded sympathetically. "Did the officers seem to recognize their mistake when neighbors identified him?" Mrs. Chen's expression hardened. "They didn't care. Even after we told them who he was, even after they confirmed it on their radio, they kept him handcuffed on the ground. I have never been so ashamed of our local police." Similar interviews were happening all over the neighborhood. Tom Wilson, the retired Coast Guard officer, had shared his video with every news outlet that asked. By mid-morning, The story had gone national. U.S. Navy Admiral handcuffed outside his home read the headline on CNN. War hero humiliated by local police, declared Fox News. Racial profiling or simple mistake? Admiral incident raises questions, pondered the Washington Post. The viral spread of the story brought a flood of reactions. Veterans groups expressed outrage. Military forums buzzed with anger. Police accountability activists pointed to the incident as another example of systemic problems. By noon, the Pine Grove police station was surrounded by reporters and camera crews. Inside, officers Taylor and Johnson were meeting with their union representatives, while Chief Walker prepared for what would undoubtedly be the most difficult press conference of his career. "You need to be transparent," advised the department's public relations officer. "Acknowledge the mistake, outline the steps being taken to address it, and emphasize that this is not representative of our department's values." Chief Walker nodded, but he knew no prepared statement would make this go away. The damage was done and the consequences were just beginning. At 1:30 p.m., Admiral Harrington's car pulled up to the police station. The media presence doubled as word spread that he had arrived. Dressed in his full Navy uniform, his chest adorned with rows of medals and ribbons that told the story of a lifetime of service, Harrington stepped out of the car with Lieutenant Commander Rivera at his side. The flashes of cameras created a strobe-like effect as he walked toward the entrance. Reporters shouted questions, but Harrington moved forward with the same purposeful stride that had carried him across the decks of aircraft carriers. His face revealed nothing of his thoughts. Inside, Chief Walker was waiting in the lobby. The two men had never met before. Walker, a 30-year police veteran who had worked his way up from patrol officer, found himself uncharacteristically nervous as he extended his hand. "Admiral Harrington, I'm Chief Daniel Walker. Thank you for coming." Harrington shook his hand firmly. "Chief, I believe we have important matters to discuss." They moved to the chief's office away from the press. Lieutenant Commander Rivera remained outside, while the mayor's representative and Commander Hayes from JAG joined them. "Admiral," Chief Walker began once they were seated, "I want to start by offering my most sincere apology for what happened last night. There is no excuse for how you were treated, and I take full responsibility as the head of this department." Harrington studied the chief for a moment before responding. "I appreciate that, Chief Walker. But I'm not here for apologies. I'm here for action. What specific steps are you taking to address this incident and prevent similar occurrences in the future?" The directness of the question was typical of Harrington's leadership style. He wasn't interested in platitudes or promises. He wanted concrete plans. Chief Walker had anticipated this. The two officers involved have been placed on administrative leave, pending a full investigation. We've already identified several procedural failures and training gaps that contributed to the incident. "Go on," Harrington said, his expression unchanged. "We're implementing immediate department-wide training on proper identification of military personnel and appropriate escalation protocols. I've also ordered a review of all traffic stop procedures, with special attention to when officers should and should not draw their weapons." Harrington nodded slightly. "Those are good first steps, Chief, but they address symptoms, not causes. I'd like to hear your assessment of why this happened in the first place." The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Was it poor training? Bad judgment? Implicit bias? Something else entirely? Chief Walker took a deep breath. After 30 years in law enforcement, he knew there were rarely simple answers to such questions. "Admiral, I believe this was a failure at multiple levels. The officers received a report of a stolen vehicle that matched your rental car's description. That's where it should have ended, with verification of your identity and an apology for the inconvenience." He continued, "Instead, they escalated the situation unnecessarily. They failed to properly assess the circumstances, failed to listen when you identified yourself, and failed to respond appropriately when neighbors confirmed your identity. That points to issues with training, judgment, and possibly an overly aggressive approach to routine stops." Harrington considered this. "I want to be clear, Chief. I understand that police work is difficult and dangerous. I command people who risk their lives daily. What I cannot accept is a system that allows for this kind of mistake without immediate correction once new information becomes available." "I agree completely," Chief Walker said. "That's the most troubling aspect of this incident. Even after they knew who you were, they continued as if you were a suspect. The meeting continued for almost an hour, with detailed discussions of police procedures, training programs, and accountability measures. By the end, both men had a clearer understanding of the path forward. As they prepared to conclude, Harrington asked, "I'd like to meet with the officers involved." The request surprised Chief Walker. "Are you sure, Admiral? They're currently in the building with their union representatives, but—" "I'm sure," Harrington said firmly. "I think it's important." 10 minutes later, Officers Taylor and Johnson entered the conference room where Harrington waited alone. Both looked nervous, their faces pale with stress and lack of sleep. "Sit down, officers," Harrington said, his tone neutral. They sat across from him, neither able to maintain eye contact for long. "I wanted to meet with you because I believe in addressing problems directly," Harrington began. "Last night you made a series of poor decisions that had serious consequences. Do you understand why your actions were problematic?" Officer Johnson spoke first. "Yes, sir. We failed to properly verify your identity despite multiple confirmations. We escalated the situation unnecessarily and maintained that escalation even after we knew who you were." Harrington nodded. "And you, Officer Taylor?" The younger officer swallowed hard. "I drew my weapon without sufficient cause, sir. I didn't listen when you tried to explain who you were. I treated you with disrespect." "I appreciate your honesty," Harrington said. "I'm not here to berate you or demand your badges. I've spent my career leading young men and women, many not much older than you, Officer Taylor. I understand that people make mistakes." Both officers looked surprised at his tone. "However," Harrington continued, his voice hardening slightly, "mistakes have consequences. Your actions last night were more than a simple error in judgment. They reflect systemic issues in training and procedure that must be addressed." He leaned forward, fixing each officer with a direct gaze. "I expect you both to fully cooperate with the investigation. I expect you to reflect deeply on your actions and consider how you might have handled the situation differently. And I expect you to become better officers because of this experience." As the meeting concluded and Harrington prepared to leave, Officer Taylor spoke up. "Admiral, may I ask a question?" Harrington nodded. "Why did you want to meet with us? You could have just let the investigation take its course." Harrington considered the question carefully. "Because I believe that real change happens face to face, officer to officer, person to person, not through press releases or policy documents. Remember that when you're back on patrol." As Harrington left the police station, the waiting press surged forward. This time, he stopped to make a brief statement. "Today I met with Chief Walker and the officers involved in last night's incident. While I cannot discuss the details of an ongoing investigation, I can say that I am committed to working with the Pine Grove Police Department to ensure that what happened to me doesn't happen to others." A reporter called out, "Are you planning to sue the department, Admiral?" Harrington shook his head. "This isn't about lawsuits or personal compensation. It's about accountability and improvement. The true measure of our response to this incident will be in the changes that follow." With that, he returned to his car, leaving behind a police department forever changed by a traffic stop gone wrong, and a community watching closely to see what would happen next. The escalation had occurred in minutes on a quiet suburban street. The consequences would unfold for months to come, touching lives far beyond those directly involved. And at the center of it all was a man who had faced greater dangers on the high seas, but found himself fighting a different kind of battle on the streets of his hometown. A battle for dignity, respect, and lasting change. 3 days after the incident, Admiral Harrington stood at the podium in the Norfolk Naval Station's main conference room. The space was packed with reporters from local and national media. Behind him sat a row of high-ranking naval officers and civilian officials, including the mayor of Pine Grove and, surprisingly to many, Chief Walker of the Pine Grove Police Department. Harrington adjusted the microphone and looked out at the sea of faces. The room fell silent. "Good morning," he began, his deep voice carrying easily through the room. "I've called this press conference to address the incident that occurred outside my home earlier this week and to announce several important developments." The cameras flashed continuously as he spoke. "As many of you know, I was detained at gunpoint by police officers while returning home from deployment. I was handcuffed and forced to lie face down on the pavement, despite identifying myself as a Rear Admiral in the United States Navy, and despite confirmation of my identity from neighbors and police dispatch. He paused, letting the facts sink in. This incident has generated significant public attention, and rightfully so. When someone who has served this country for nearly 3 decades is treated this way, it raises serious questions about police procedures, training, and accountability. A murmur went through the crowd of reporters. However, Harrington continued, I want to be clear about something. This press conference is not about pointing fingers or assigning blame. It's about finding solutions. He gestured to Chief Walker, who nodded in acknowledgement. Over the past 72 hours, I have had several productive meetings with Chief Walker and his leadership team. I've also spoken with the mayor, the governor, and senior officials at the Department of Defense. What began as an unfortunate incident has evolved into an opportunity for meaningful change. Harrington took a sip of water before continuing. Today, I am announcing the formation of the Military Law Enforcement Cooperation Initiative. This joint program between the United States Navy and local police departments will develop new training protocols, communication systems, and community engagement strategies to prevent similar incidents in the future. The announcement generated immediate interest, with reporters leaning forward and furiously taking notes. Chief Walker and the Pine Grove Police Department have agreed to serve as the pilot agency for this initiative. They have committed to a top-to-bottom review of their procedures, with special attention to interactions with military personnel. Harrington turned slightly toward the chief, giving him a respectful nod. I want to commend Chief Walker for his leadership during this difficult time. Rather than becoming defensive or attempting to minimize what happened, he has embraced this as a chance for his department to improve and to help other departments across the country do the same. This was not what most people had expected. The narrative of conflict between a wronged military officer and an unaccountable police department had dominated headlines for days. Now Harrington was presenting a different story, one of collaboration and positive change. I'll now invite Chief Walker to share the specific steps his department is taking, Harrington said. Stepping back from the podium, Chief Walker approached, looking both solemn and determined. The past 3 days had aged him visibly, with new lines around his eyes and a slight stoop to his shoulders that hadn't been there before. Thank you, Admiral Harrington, he began. First, I want to publicly apologize to you again for what happened. There is no excuse for how you were treated, and as Chief of Police, I take full responsibility. He turned to face the cameras directly, effective immediately. The Pine Grove Police Department is implementing several changes. We are revising our protocols for traffic stops and suspect identification. We are enhancing our training on de-escalation techniques and proper recognition of military identification. And we are creating a new community advisory board that will include active and retired military personnel. Chief Walker continued, outlining additional reforms including body camera policy updates, new supervision requirements for junior officers, and a comprehensive review of use of force protocols. Finally, he said, I want to address the status of the officers involved in the incident. Following a thorough internal investigation, Officer Brian Taylor has been suspended without pay for 30 days and will be required to complete extensive retraining before returning to patrol duties. Officer Robert Johnson, as the senior officer present, has been suspended for 60 days without pay and removed from field training duties permanently. This announcement caused another stir in the room. Many had expected the officers to be fired outright. Harrington returned to the podium as Chief Walker stepped back. I support these disciplinary actions, Harrington stated clearly. While some may feel they don't go far enough, I believe they strike the right balance between accountability and opportunity for growth. These officers made serious mistakes, but ending their careers would not serve the greater goal of improving police practices across the board. A reporter called out, Admiral, are you saying you forgive the officers who held you at gunpoint? Harrington considered the question carefully. Forgiveness isn't the point, he replied. This isn't about my personal feelings toward these officers. It's about creating systems that work better for everyone, civilians, police, and military personnel alike. These officers will carry this incident with them for the rest of their careers. The real measure of justice will be whether they learn from it and become better officers as a result. Another reporter asked, Chief Walker, how do you respond to calls for your resignation over this incident? Walker stepped forward again. I serve at the pleasure of the mayor and the people of Pine Grove. If they decide my leadership is no longer effective, I'll accept that decision. But as long as I remain chief, I'm committed to leading these reforms and ensuring that what happened to Admiral Harrington never happens again in our community. The press conference continued for another 30 minutes, with questions ranging from specific details about the new initiative to broader inquiries about police-military relations. Throughout, Harrington maintained his calm, authoritative presence, neither minimizing the seriousness of what had occurred nor inflaming tensions further. As the event concluded, Harrington and Walker left the stage together, presenting a united front that few could have predicted days earlier. Outside the conference room, away from the cameras, Harrington's wife Laura waited. She had flown back from Boston immediately after hearing about the incident. When Harrington emerged, she embraced him tightly. "You did well in there," she said quietly. After 30 years of marriage to a naval officer, she had developed a keen sense for public relations strategies. "Though I'm not sure everyone will understand why you're working with them instead of against them." Harrington smiled slightly. "They don't have to understand. They just have to see that it works." Later that afternoon at the Harrington home, a small gathering took place. Admiral Harrington had invited several key people: Tom Wilson and Mrs. Chen, the neighbors who had witnessed and recorded the incident, Commander Hayes from the JAG office, the mayor of Pine Grove, and most surprisingly, Sergeant Peterson, who had been the first supervising officer to arrive at the scene that night. They sat in the Harringtons' living room, an unlikely group brought together by extraordinary circumstances. "I wanted to thank you all for your different roles in this situation," Harrington began, "and to share some thoughts that didn't belong in a press conference." Mrs. Chen, still visibly angry about what had happened, spoke up. "I don't understand why those officers still have jobs, Jim. What they did to you was inexcusable." Harrington nodded respectfully. "I understand your feelings, Helen, but this isn't just about punishment. It's about creating lasting change." Tom Wilson, who had served in the military himself, seemed to grasp Harrington's strategy. "You're playing the long game, aren't you, Admiral?" "Exactly," Harrington confirmed. "If I had pushed for those officers to be fired, what would happen? There would be appeals, union grievances, prolonged legal battles. The department would become defensive. Other departments would see it as an attack on all police, and in the end, nothing meaningful would change." The mayor, who had initially expected a public relations disaster, looked relieved. "Your approach has turned a potential crisis into an opportunity for our community." "That's the goal," Harrington said. "But make no mistake, I expect real results. This isn't about a feel-good story or positive headlines. It's about substantive reforms that will protect others from going through what I experienced." Sergeant Peterson, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "Admiral, I want you to know that many officers in the department are grateful for how you've handled this. They're embarrassed by what happened and want to do better." Harrington fixed him with a steady gaze. "Then I expect them to embrace the changes that are coming, Sergeant. Because I'll be watching very closely, and I won't hesitate to use my influence differently if I don't see genuine progress." The message was clear. Harrington's collaborative approach wasn't weakness. It was strategic. And it came with expectations that would need to be met. As the small gathering continued, across town at the Pine Grove police station, officers Taylor and Johnson were cleaning out their lockers before beginning their suspensions. "I still can't believe we did that to a rear admiral," Taylor said, his voice low. The past few days had been the most difficult of his short career. He had barely slept, replaying the incident over and over in his mind, seeing all the points where he could have, should have, done things differently. Johnson closed his locker with a heavy click. "We're lucky to still have jobs. If he had wanted our badges, we'd be done." "Why didn't he?" Taylor asked. "He has every right to be furious." Johnson considered this. "Because he's thinking about something bigger than us, kid. He didn't get those stars on his shoulders by being short-sighted or vengeful." As they left the station, they passed a conference room where a group of senior officers were already meeting with representatives from the Navy to begin developing the new training protocols. The work of reform had already begun. Meanwhile, back at Norfolk Naval Station, Lieutenant Commander Rivera was briefing Admiral Harrington's staff on the next phases of the military law enforcement cooperation initiative. The Admiral wants this program ready to expand to other cities within 6 months, Rivera explained, pointing to a timeline on the screen. Phase 1 is the Pine Grove pilot program. Phase 2 will include 5 additional cities with large military populations. Phase 3 will be a nationwide rollout. One of the staff officers raised a hand. Has the Pentagon signed off on this? Rivera nodded. The Secretary of Defense has personally approved the initiative. After seeing the video of what happened to Admiral Harrington, there's significant support at the highest levels. Another officer asked, "What about funding?" "That's being worked out now," Rivera replied. "The Admiral has meetings scheduled with key congressional committees next week. Given the bipartisan support for both military and police reform, we anticipate no major obstacles." As the briefing continued, it became clear that what had begun as a frightening and humiliating experience for one man was transforming into something much larger, a catalyst for systemic change that could affect police, departments, and military communities across the country that evening. As Admiral Harrington finally had a quiet moment alone with his wife, she asked the question that had been on her mind since the press conference. "Are you really okay with how this is being handled, Jim? Being diplomatic is part of your job. But this happened to you personally. Those men put you face down on the pavement at gunpoint." Harrington was silent for a moment, looking out the window toward the street where it had happened. "When I was a young officer," he finally said, "I had a commanding officer who taught me something important. He said, never waste a crisis. What happened was wrong. It was infuriating. It was humiliating. But now I have the attention of everyone from the local police chief to the Secretary of Defense. I'd be a poor leader if I didn't use that attention to create something positive." Laura took his hand. After 3 decades of watching him navigate military politics and international crises, she recognized the strategic mind at work. "Just promise me one thing," she said. "What's that?" "Promise me that if they don't follow through, if this initiative becomes just a public relations exercise, you'll hold them accountable." Harrington's expression hardened slightly. "Count on it. This isn't over. In many ways, it's just beginning." Outside, news vans were still parked along their street. The story continued to dominate local headlines and had maintained a presence in national news cycles. What had transpired in a few minutes on a quiet suburban street had set in motion events that would continue to unfold for months and years to come. The revelation had occurred, not just about what had happened that night, but about what could happen next. A moment of crisis had been transformed into an opportunity for lasting change, and at the center of it all was a leader who understood that true power lay not in retaliation, but in transformation. 1 week after the press conference, the impact of what had come to be known simply as the Harrington incident continued to spread in widening circles. What had begun as a local police matter had transformed into a national conversation about military-police relations, proper use of force, and accountability in law enforcement. Admiral Harrington's morning began with a secure video call to the Pentagon. On his screen were faces that represented the highest levels of military leadership: the Chief of Naval Operations, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Secretary of Defense. "Jim, we've reviewed your proposal for the Military Law Enforcement Cooperation Initiative," the Secretary began. "I'm impressed by how quickly you've developed this framework." Harrington nodded his thanks. "Time is essential, Mr. Secretary. The momentum from this incident gives us a unique opportunity to implement meaningful changes." The chairman of the Joint Chiefs leaned forward. "We've all seen the video, Jim. Nobody blames you for being angry about how you were treated. But turning this into a constructive program instead of a personal grievance, that's leadership." "Thank you, sir," Harrington replied, "but I'd like to focus on next steps. We need DoD backing to expand this beyond Pine Grove." "You have it," the Secretary confirmed. "I've already spoken with the Attorney General. The Department of Justice is interested in partnering with us on this initiative. They see potential for it to address broader issues in police training and community relations." The Chief of Naval Operations added, "The other service branches want to get involved too. This isn't just a Navy issue. It affects all military personnel and their families." This was exactly what Harrington had hoped for. What had happened to him was unfortunate. But if it led to systemic improvements that protected others, something valuable would come from it. "There's one more thing," the Secretary said as the meeting concluded. "The President would like to meet with you next week to discuss this initiative personally. He sees this as aligning with his broader goals for criminal justice reform." Harrington kept his expression neutral. But this was a significant development. Presidential attention would ensure resources, visibility, and momentum for the program. "I'd be honored to brief the president," he replied. As the video call ended, Lieutenant Commander Rivera entered with the daily schedule. "Sir, Chief Walker is here for your 10 a.m. meeting." "Send him in," Harrington said, straightening his uniform. Chief Walker entered the office looking noticeably different from the man who had stood beside Harrington at the press conference a week earlier. There was a new energy in his step, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. "Admiral," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for seeing me." "Have a seat, Chief," Harrington replied, gesturing to a chair. "How are things at the department?" Walker sat, placing a folder on the desk between them. "Challenging, but in a good way. The reforms we announced are being implemented. Some officers are resistant, as expected, but most see the value in what we're doing. And the community response? Mixed," Walker admitted. "Many people think the disciplinary actions against Taylor and Johnson weren't severe enough. Others appreciate that we're making substantive changes rather than just offering apologies." Harrington nodded. He had anticipated this divided reaction. "And the officers themselves?" "Officer Taylor started his retraining program yesterday. He's young, adaptable. I think this experience will ultimately make him a better officer." Walker paused. "Johnson is having a harder time. 30 years on the force and now this on his record. But he's committed to seeing it through." "Good," Harrington said. "Now what's in the folder?" Walker opened it to reveal a set of documents. "These are the draft protocols we've developed based on the framework your team provided. New guidelines for identifying military personnel, updated training modules on de-escalation, and revised use of force policies." Harrington looked through the materials with a critical eye. His naval career had taught him to pay attention to details. Lives often depended on it. "This is a solid start," he said finally. "But I see some gaps in the implementation timeline, and the accountability measures need to be stronger." Walker didn't bristle at the criticism. Instead, he took notes as Harrington outlined specific concerns and suggestions. "We'll address these issues," Walker promised, "and I have some news you might be interested in. 3 other police departments in the region have reached out to us about adopting similar reforms. Word is spreading faster than we anticipated." This was unexpected but welcome news. Harrington had planned for a carefully managed expansion of the initiative, but if other departments were already showing interest, the impact could grow more quickly than projected. As their meeting concluded, Walker asked a question that had clearly been on his mind. "Admiral, can I ask you something personally?" Harrington nodded. "How do you really feel about all this? Not the official line for the press, but your honest thoughts. If I were in your position, I'm not sure I could put aside my anger so effectively." It was a fair question, and Harrington took a moment to consider his answer. "Chief, I've commanded ships in combat zones. I've made decisions that sent young men and women into harm's way. I've lost people under my command." His voice remained steady, but there was an intensity to his words. When you carry that kind of responsibility, you learn to separate personal feelings from professional judgment. He continued, "Am I still angry about what happened? Yes. Do I let that anger dictate my actions? No. Because there's something more important at stake here than my pride or my desire for personal vindication." Walker seemed to understand. "The greater good." "Exactly," Harrington confirmed. "And right now the greater good is served by working together to fix broken systems, not by tearing each other down." After Chief Walker left, Harrington had a brief moment alone before his next meeting. He walked to the window of his office, looking out over the naval base where ships and sailors represented the power and responsibility of the United States Navy. In 30 years of service, he had faced many challenges, but none quite like this, turning a personal humiliation into an opportunity for positive change. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife. CNN doing a segment on the initiative at noon. Looks like the national attention is growing. Indeed it was. Throughout the day, Harrington moved from one meeting to another as the machinery of institutional change began to move forward. Naval legal experts worked with police trainers to develop new protocols. Pentagon officials coordinated with the Department of Justice. Congressional staffers discussed potential legislation to support the initiative. At 3 p.m., Harrington received an unexpected visitor, Congressman Howard Lewis, chair of the House Committee on Armed Services, who had flown in specifically to discuss the initiative. "Admiral," Lewis said as they shook hands, "what you're doing here has caught the attention of a lot of people in Washington. I hope that's a good thing." "Congressman," Harrington replied with a slight smile. Lewis chuckled. "It is, though not everyone is comfortable with the pace you're setting. Some of my colleagues think this kind of institutional change should take years of committee hearings and reports. With all due respect, Congressman, we don't have years. We have a window of opportunity right now while people are paying attention. If we wait, the momentum will be lost." The congressman nodded thoughtfully. "I agree. That's why I'm here. My committee is prepared to hold hearings next month on military-police interactions. We'd like you to testify." This was another significant step forward. Congressional hearings would provide a platform to advocate for the resources and policy changes needed to expand the initiative nationally. "I'd be honored," Harrington said. As the day progressed, more developments unfolded. The governor announced the formation of a state-level task force to implement similar reforms across all police departments in Virginia. Military family advocacy groups issued statements of support for the initiative. Police leadership organizations, initially cautious, began to express interest in the training protocols being developed. By evening, when Harrington finally returned home, he was exhausted but satisfied with the progress being made. His wife greeted him at the door with a knowing look. "Busy day?" she asked. "Very," he confirmed. "But productive." Laura handed him a glass of his favorite scotch. "You've been all over the news, again." They moved to the living room where the television was showing yet another news segment about the initiative. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, "From incident to initiative, how one admiral is changing police-military relations." "They're making it sound like I'm single-handedly reforming American policing," Harrington said with a hint of discomfort. He had never sought the spotlight during his naval career, preferring to let his actions speak for themselves. "That's what happens when you turn a potential scandal into a constructive program," Laura pointed out. "People take notice, and she was right, of course." The narrative had shifted dramatically from where it had been a week ago. Instead of headlines about police misconduct and a humiliated admiral, the story now focused on collaboration, reform, and positive change. As they watched the news coverage, their doorbell rang. Laura answered and returned with an unexpected guest, Mrs. Chen from across the street. "Helen," Harrington said, rising to greet his neighbor. "This is a surprise." Mrs. Chen seemed hesitant, which was unusual for the normally outspoken woman. "I hope I'm not interrupting, Jim. I wanted to talk to you about something." "Not at all," he assured her. "What's on your mind?" She sat down, still seeming uncomfortable. "I've been watching everything you're doing with the police department, all these changes and programs. And I have to admit, I don't understand it." Harrington waited for her to continue. "They humiliated you, Jim. They put you on the ground like a criminal. They didn't listen when you told them who you were." "They didn't listen when I told them who you were." Her voice rose slightly with remembered anger. "And now you're working with them like nothing happened." It was a perspective Harrington had heard from others as well, the belief that his collaborative approach somehow minimized the seriousness of what had occurred. "Helen," he said gently, "I understand how you feel, and I appreciate how you stood up for me that night. But this isn't about forgetting what happened or pretending it wasn't serious." "Then what is it about?" she asked directly. "It's about making sure it doesn't happen to someone else," Harrington explained. "Someone who might not have neighbors looking out for them. Someone who might not have my rank or resources." Mrs. Chen considered this. "Think about it this way," Harrington continued. "If I had just filed a lawsuit or demanded those officers be fired, what would change? Maybe those two specific officers wouldn't be on the force anymore. Maybe I'd get some financial settlement. But the system that allowed it to happen would remain untouched." Understanding began to dawn on Mrs. Chen's face. "So instead, you're changing the system." "Trying to," Harrington confirmed. "And that requires working with people on all sides, including the police department." Mrs. Chen nodded slowly. "I think I see now. It's like when you find a problem in a ship's engine. You don't just get angry at the engine, you fix it so it doesn't break down again." Harrington smiled at the analogy. "Exactly. And sometimes fixing the engine requires working with the very people who were responsible for maintaining it in the first place." As Mrs. Chen left, Seeming more at peace with Harrington's approach, Laura turned to her husband. You just converted one of your strongest supporters who wanted retribution into someone who understands reform. One conversation at a time, Harrington said. That's how real change happens. The next morning brought another development. Lieutenant Commander Rivera arrived at Harrington's office with news that Officer Brian Taylor had requested a meeting. He says it's personal, not official, Rivera reported. I can tell him you're too busy if you prefer. Harrington considered the request. No, I'll see him. But schedule it for later today, after the video conference with the JAG Corps. When Officer Taylor arrived that afternoon, he was in civilian clothes, looking much younger and more vulnerable without his uniform and badge. Harrington invited him to sit, studying the young man who had pointed a gun at him just days earlier. Thank you for seeing me, Admiral, Taylor began, his voice unsteady. I didn't know if you would. Why did you want to meet? Harrington asked directly. Taylor took a deep breath. I wanted to apologize to you personally, not through official channels or press statements. What I did was wrong. I made assumptions, I escalated unnecessarily, and I failed to listen when you identified yourself. Harrington listened without interrupting. I've been going through the retraining program, Taylor continued, and every day I watch the body cam footage of that night. I see all the moments where I could have made different choices. It's hard to watch. It should be, Harrington said, not unkindly but firmly. Learning from mistakes is supposed to be uncomfortable. Taylor nodded. I understand now why you didn't push to have me fired. At first I thought maybe you were just being generous or taking the high road, but after seeing what you're building with this initiative, I realize there's more to it. And what do you think that is? Harrington asked, curious about the young officer's perspective. You're using what happened to create something bigger, Taylor said, something that will help officers like me make better decisions in the field. And you couldn't do that if you'd just gotten us fired and walked away. It was an insightful observation from someone so early in their career. Perhaps there was hope for this young officer after all. What will you do differently when you return to duty? Harrington asked. Taylor didn't hesitate. Listen first. Consider all possibilities before escalating. Remember that my badge gives me authority, but how I use that authority defines who I am as an officer. These were the right answers, but Harrington knew that real change would be measured in actions, not words. Still, the young man's sincerity seemed genuine. I appreciate you coming here today, Officer Taylor, Harrington said as their meeting concluded. But remember, your apology to me is just the beginning. The real test will be how you serve your community going forward. As Taylor left, Harrington reflected on the conversation. It represented in microcosm what the entire initiative aimed to achieve. Not just punishment for past mistakes, but transformation and improvement for the future. The remainder of the week brought a flurry of activity as the initiative gained momentum. The Pentagon formally announced its support, allocating initial funding and resources. The Justice Department designated a liaison to work with Harrington's team. Congressional staffers began drafting legislation to provide federal backing for the program. At the local level, the Pine Grove Police Department became an unexpected model for reform. Other departments sent representatives to observe the new training protocols being implemented. Chief Walker found himself speaking at regional law enforcement conferences about the changes underway in his department. And at the center of it all was Admiral Harrington, navigating the complex intersection of military authority, law enforcement practices, and public policy with the same strategic thinking that had served him well throughout his naval career. The immediate fallout from that night on Maple Street continued to expand, touching institutions and individuals far beyond those directly involved. What had begun as a frightening and humiliating experience for one man was becoming a catalyst for systemic change that could potentially benefit thousands. As Harrington prepared for his upcoming meeting with the president, he reviewed the progress made in just 2 weeks. It was remarkable how quickly things could move when the right pressure was applied to the right points in the system. His phone rang. It was the Secretary of the Navy. Jim, the Secretary said without preamble, I just wanted you to know that the President has been briefed on the initiative. He's not just supportive, he's enthusiastic. He sees this as a potential signature achievement for his administration. That's good to hear, sir, Harrington replied. There's more, the Secretary continued. There's talk about expanding your role. The president is considering appointing you to lead a new task force on military-community relations after you complete your current assignment. This was unexpected news. Harrington had been focused on the immediate tasks at hand, not on what this might mean for his own career. "I'm honored by the consideration," he said carefully, "but my focus right now is on making sure the current initiative succeeds." "Of course," the secretary agreed. "Just something to think about." This incident, unfortunate as it was, has revealed leadership qualities that have caught attention at the highest levels. After the call ended, Harrington sat quietly for a moment. His wife found him like that when she stopped by his office to take him to lunch. "What is it?" she asked, recognizing the look on his face. He shared the secretary's comments with her. "They're right," she said simply. "You've turned a potential disaster into an opportunity for real change. That's what leadership is." Harrington smiled slightly. "I was just doing what needed to be done." "Exactly," Laura replied. "And people notice when someone steps up and does what needs to be done, especially when it would have been easier to take a different path." As they left for lunch, Harrington reflected on how much had changed in just 2 weeks. The officers who had pointed guns at him were now part of a reform process that could reshape police practices nationwide. The incident that had humiliated him was becoming a case study in constructive response to misconduct, and his own career was potentially taking a new direction because of how he had handled the situation. The immediate fallout continued to expand, touching more lives and institutions with each passing day. But unlike the negative consequences one might expect from such an incident, these were ripples of positive change, reform, education, cooperation, and improvement, and they were just beginning. 3 years had passed since that fateful night on Maple Street. The world had changed in countless ways, but perhaps nowhere more profoundly than in the relationship between law enforcement agencies and military communities across the United States. Admiral James Harrington, now Vice Admiral Harrington following his promotion last year, stood at the podium in the White House Rose Garden. Behind him sat rows of distinguished guests, military leaders, police chiefs, legislators, community advocates, and in the front row, his wife Laura. The President of the United States stood nearby, ready to sign the Military Law Enforcement Cooperation Act into law, legislation that would permanently establish the programs Harrington had pioneered. 3 years ago, Harrington began, his voice carrying across the hushed garden, "I was detained at gunpoint outside my own home. What could have remained a personal grievance or a brief news story instead became the catalyst for the most comprehensive reform of police-military relations in our nation's history." He paused, looking out at the assembled crowd. "Today, we mark the transformation of what began as the Military Law Enforcement Cooperation Initiative into permanent federal policy. This legislation provides training, resources, and accountability measures to ensure that similar incidents don't happen to others, whether they wear stars on their shoulders or not." There was applause, but Harrington raised a hand to continue. "This journey has taught me valuable lessons about how institutions can change when people on all sides commit to improvement rather than blame. It has shown me that even painful experiences can lead to positive outcomes when we focus on solutions instead of grievances." From his position at the podium, Harrington could see faces that represented every stage of this 3-year journey. Chief Walker of the Pine Grove Police Department, now a nationally recognized advocate for police reform. Tom Wilson, the neighbor who had recorded the incident and later became a community liaison for the initiative. Commander Hayes from the JAG office, who had helped draft the legal framework for the program. And somewhat surprisingly, Officers Taylor and Johnson, the 2 men who had pointed guns at him that night. Both were still with the Pine Grove Police Department. Taylor had risen to become a training officer, using his own experience to teach others about proper procedures and de-escalation techniques. Johnson had taken a position in community relations, working specifically with military families in the area. "The results speak for themselves," Harrington continued. "In the past 3 years, incidents involving police and military personnel have decreased by 87% in communities that have implemented these protocols. Unnecessary escalation during routine stops has dropped by 64% overall. And perhaps most importantly, trust between police departments and the communities they serve has measurably improved. These weren't just empty statistics. They represented real changes in how police officers approach their duties and how military personnel and civilians experience law enforcement. This success was not achieved by one person or one organization, Harrington emphasized. It required collaboration across traditional boundaries. It required police officers willing to examine and improve their practices. It required military leaders committed to constructive engagement rather than criticism. It required community members who demanded accountability while supporting positive change. As he spoke, Harrington reflected on the long journey from that night to this moment. There had been challenges along the way. Initial resistance from police unions concerned about additional oversight. Skepticism from military communities who wanted more punitive measures. Budget battles in Congress over funding for the program. But there had also been unexpected allies and moments of profound progress. Police chiefs who became champions of the reforms after seeing their effectiveness. Military families who volunteered to participate in training programs. Legislators from across the political spectrum who recognized the value of improving these critical community relationships. This legislation, Harrington continued, contains 3 key components that will ensure lasting change. First, standardized training protocols for police interactions with military personnel and their families. Second, communication systems that allow for rapid verification of military identity and status. And third, community engagement programs that build relationships before crises occur. He turned slightly toward the president. Mr. President, by signing this act today, you are cementing these reforms into national policy. You are ensuring that what began as a response to one incident will continue to protect and serve Americans for generations to come. The president stepped forward, shaking Harrington's hand before addressing the gathering himself. Vice Admiral Harrington demonstrated true leadership not by seeking personal vindication, but by working for systemic change, the president said. He showed us that the measure of character isn't found in how we respond when things go right, but in how we react when things go wrong. As the president prepared to sign the legislation, Harrington's thoughts drifted back to specific moments in the 3-year journey. 6 months after the incident, standing in a classroom at the Pine Grove Police Academy, watching new recruits learn proper procedures for identifying military personnel. The serious expressions on their faces as they watched the body cam footage from that night, followed by a demonstration of the correct approach. 1 year after, sitting across from Officer Taylor during his final evaluation, before returning to full duties. The young officer had completed extensive retraining and community service. I'll never forget what happened, Taylor had said, but I want to use it to become a better officer. 18 months after, testifying before Congress alongside Chief Walker. What had once been an adversarial relationship had evolved into a productive partnership. Together, they had made a compelling case for national adoption of the program they had pioneered. 2 years after, visiting military bases around the country to brief service members on the new protocols. The gratitude in their faces when they realized someone was addressing a concern many had experienced, but few had reported. And just last month, returning to that spot on Maple Street where he had been forced to lie face down on the pavement, standing there not with anger or resentment, but with the satisfaction of knowing that something constructive had emerged from that moment of humiliation. The sound of applause brought Harrington back to the present. The president had signed the legislation. Cameras flashed as the 2 men shook hands again, holding the signed document between them for the official photos. After the ceremony, a small reception was held in the White House. Harrington found himself approached by Officer Taylor, now Sergeant Taylor following his recent promotion. Admiral, Taylor said, extending his hand. Congratulations. This wouldn't have happened without your leadership. Harrington shook his hand. It wouldn't have happened without your willingness to learn and change, Sergeant. How are things at the department? Good, sir. I'm running the training program now for new recruits. The first thing I tell them is about that night. Not just what we did wrong, but why it was wrong and how to do better. Harrington nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of institutional memory we need to maintain. The lessons can't be forgotten when the headlines fade. Later, Harrington found himself speaking with Chief Walker, who was preparing to retire after 35 years in law enforcement. When I think about my legacy as chief, Walker said reflectively, The work we've done together these past 3 years is what I'm most proud of. We took a terrible mistake and turned it into something valuable. That was your choice, Dan, Harrington pointed out. You could have circled the wagons, defended the officers unconditionally, tried to minimize what happened. Many chiefs would have, Walker shook his head. Maybe once upon a time I would have too. But that night changed something for all of us. It forced us to look at ourselves differently. As the reception continued, Laura joined her husband, slipping her arm through his. You did it, she said quietly. We did it, he corrected. All of us together, she smiled. Always the team player. But sometimes, someone has to lead the team in the right direction. That was you, Jim. Before they left the White House, Harrington had one more conversation. This one with Tom Wilson, the neighbor who had recorded the incident on his phone. You know, Wilson said, when I started recording that night, I thought I was documenting something terrible. I never imagined it would lead to all this. That's often how change begins, Harrington replied, with someone bearing witness to something that needs to change. The following day, Harrington returned to Norfolk Naval Station for a more personal commemoration of the legislation's signing. He had arranged a small gathering of those who had been involved from the beginning: neighbors, naval colleagues, police officers, and community members. Mrs. Chen was there, still living across the street from the Harrington home. I remember how angry I was, she admitted during the gathering. I couldn't understand why you were working with the police instead of against them. Now I see what you were building. Officer Johnson, who had never fully regained his former status in the department, but had found a new purpose in community relations, spoke as well. I made a terrible mistake that night. But Admiral Harrington gave me the chance to be part of the solution instead of just being punished for the problem. As the gathering continued, Harrington stepped outside for a moment, looking up at the stars visible in the clear night sky. His naval career had taken him around the world, placed him in command of powerful ships and brave sailors, earned him honors and promotions. But perhaps nothing he had done had the same potential for lasting impact as the work of these past 3 years. What had begun in humiliation and anger had evolved into something constructive and enduring. The lasting consequences of that night on Maple Street would be felt not in lingering resentment or unresolved grievances, but in better trained police officers, more engaged military communities, and stronger relationships between those who served in different uniforms, but with the same fundamental purpose: protecting the nation and its people. When Harrington returned inside, someone asked him to say a few words. He hadn't prepared anything, but as he looked around at the faces gathered there, people who had been part of every stage of this journey, he knew what needed to be said. 3 years ago, we experienced something that could have divided us, he began. Instead, we chose to use it as an opportunity to come together. We chose to focus not on what went wrong, but on how to make things right, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who might find themselves in similar situations. He continued, the legislation signed today isn't the end of our work. It's a milestone, certainly. But the real work continues in daily interactions between police officers and the communities they serve, between military personnel and civilian authorities, between institutions that must learn to work together more effectively. Looking around the room, Harrington concluded, the true measure of what we've accomplished won't be found in a ceremony at the White House or in the text of legislation. It will be found in incidents that don't happen, in confrontations that don't escalate, in misunderstandings that are quickly resolved, in relationships built on mutual respect rather than suspicion or fear. Later that night, after everyone had gone and the Harrington home was quiet again, Laura found her husband standing at the front window, looking out toward the street where it had all begun. What are you thinking about? She asked, joining him. About how differently things might have turned out, he replied, if I had just demanded those officers be fired. If Chief Walker had just defended them unconditionally. If we had all just retreated to our respective corners and pointed fingers at each other. Laura nodded. Instead, you built bridges. We built bridges, he corrected again with a smile. And they're stronger than any of us expected. Outside, a police car drove slowly down Maple Street, a routine patrol in a quiet neighborhood. The officer behind the wheel raised a hand in respectful greeting as he passed the Harrington home. The Admiral returned the gesture, a simple acknowledgement between two people who served their country in different uniforms but with the same ultimate goal. 3 years ago, such a moment would have been unimaginable. Today, it was a small but significant symbol of how far they had come, and a promise of what could be achieved when people chose to transform incidents into initiatives, confrontation into collaboration, and grievances into growth. The lasting consequences of that night continued to unfold, not as a story of conflict and retribution, but as a testament to what was possible when leaders on all sides chose a different path. The price that had been paid was not measured in careers ended or in legal settlements, but in systems improved and relationships strengthened. And for Admiral James Harrington, that was the most meaningful victory of his long and distinguished career, not defeating an adversary, but turning a potential adversary into an ally in the cause of building a better, more just system for all.